So, congruent figures. So congruent polygons have congruent corresponding parts. Right? So each part that corresponds is congruent. So what that means is whatever sides match up and angles that match up, those are what are congruent. So a real key thing here when we talk about congruence, and this is gonna follow for all of this unit, and anytime we talk about two things being congruent, when we name these things, they have to go in the same order, right? So corresponding parts go in the same order all the way around. So like if I look at this shape down here, right? I'm talking about A, B, C, D, and E, F, G, H. They tell me here that A, B, C, D is congruent to E, F, G, H. So what that means, we're going to do this. So A corresponds to E.
B, F, D,
H, and C to G. So that's important to note. So when I'm talking about what are congruent sides and angles, so we've just listed all of the congruent angles, right? So if I'm going to write this, I'm going to say angle A is congruent to angle E. Be a good idea to write it down. You can use notes on. You can use any of your notes on your test. So that's how you'd write that, right? This little equal sign with the little tilde thing above it is congruent. So if I just keep listing those from what we already said. So when I look at, so that's all the congruent angles, right? So I've done that. So now I need to look at sides. So this is where the order becomes really important. So if I said side AB is congruent, so I'm talking about
EF.
this side here. Okay, so why EF and not FE?
Because you started with AB. A is congruent to E.
Yeah.
And not F.
So because A is congruent to E, I need to start with E and go to F. So AEB is congruent to EF. So now look at AD. That's going to be congruent to EH. And you keep going. DC is congruent to HG. And last one, which one didn't I do? So BC is congruent to FG. Right? Not too bad. All right, so sometimes it'll ask you to label congruent parts. So you can do this in a couple different ways. You can write it all out like we just did. Do that. That's fine. The other thing that you could do is you could label it with the tick marks and stuff. Remember those? Everybody looks confused?
Where you go like KJ, you would put one tick, and then whatever's congruent to it, you would put one tick, and then like HK, you would put two ticks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so looking at this is telling me that HIJK, so I forget you can't see this, HIJK is congruent to LMNO. So if I look and I say, okay, well, KJ or JK, I want to go with the order that's written. So JK is going to be congruent to what? So easy way to kind of look at this too is because they're named in order, JK is the last two letters. So I know the corresponding side has to be, did I draw this wrong?
No.
Yeah, so now KJ and NO are congruent, so I can do that. And then I look at it and say, well, what about HK? So HK would have to be congruent to LO.
You didn't even have to cross out the end.
HI is going to be congruent to LM. And then I know the last side. So sides really easy. When you have shapes like this, sometimes to label the angles gets a little messy when you have more than one. So what I would do for the angles is just say, well, I know that angle H, I would list those out, is congruent to what? L. And then I know that angle I is going to be congruent to what? What? M, yeah. Keep going, so angle J, Eric is congruent to what?
What was
It says it on the
angle
paper.
J?
J is
Congruent to N.
N.
Oh, sorry. Was he asking me?
Yeah, because he doesn't need to ask questions anyway.
I do too. Angle K is then congruent to the other one that's left, so angle O. All right. So listing them, not too bad, right? You just follow the order that it goes in. That's really important because this tells me that ABC is congruent to DEF. So they tell me that angle A is 35. So what's the measure of angle D? So here's the question. Is A and D, are they corresponding angles?
Yes.
Yeah, look, I can say, well, A and D are both in the first spot. So what does that make measure of angle D?
35 degrees.
35 degrees. All right, so we have this idea of the third angles theorem. So basically, it sounds complicated. It's not. So what it's saying is that if two angles of a triangle are congruent to two angles in another triangle, the third angle, they're also congruent. All right, so kind of looking at it and saying, well, if angle A is congruent to angle D, so that's denoted by these little semicircular things, right? A and D both have 1, so those two are congruent. And then if I look at angle B and angle E are congruent, what this is saying is that that third angle, so angle C, is going to be congruent to angle F. So it's just this idea that if I have two angles and I know them and they're the same in two triangles, the third one has to be the same. Does anybody remember what all the angles in a triangle add up to? 180. Yeah. So that comes up again and again, is this idea of 180.
Join us.
All right. So if I'm looking at this, I have two triangles here, so EFG and YXZ. So they're labeled, right? 70 and 70 for angles E and Y, and 50 for X and F. So anytime they're labeled, 2 with the value, and the values are the same, they're congruent. So I know that X and F are congruent, and Y and E are congruent. So that tells me that angle Z and G has to be congruent. So I want you guys to take a second and figure out what that 60. So if I look and I say, well, what is 70 plus 50? It would give me 120, right? What do I have to add to 120 to get to 180? 60. So angle G is equal to angle Z, which is equal to 60 degrees. So the other one, finding missing angle measures, that kind of stuff. Last thing we're going to look at is sometimes it'll say, well, what would the value of the variable have to be to make these things congruent, right? So I have these two triangles here. I don't know that they're congruent, but I want to force them, right? I want to say, no, you're going to be congruent, but what does that mean? How do I get them there? So, like if I look here, so what it's telling me is, what would I have to do? So how do I force triangle ABC to be congruent to triangle MLK? So how do I force that? So what does that mean then that angles A and M have to be? So both of be 45, they have to be congruent, right? But I want to know what does X equal then for those to be congruent? Oh, hey, look it. Sorry, Dylan. I forgot I wrote that. I couldn't see it. So I know that I have to figure out what is X. So if I want them to be the same, what's the mathematical symbol we use to represent the same? If I'm talking about two numbers are the same, what would I put in between them? What? No. So what if I said, so if I said 45 and 45, and I want to say those two things are the same, what mathematical thing is going to go in between there? What mathematical symbol represents the same?
Congruent is a good congruent sign.
So congruent does, that's for like size and equal sign. So the equal sign and congruent kind of go hand in hand. So I know I want an equal sign, right? So don't worry about writing that down. That's not super important. So, sorry. So I know that 45 has to equal 3x. And then, so this is where solving equations comes into play a little bit. So how do I get the x alone? Divide both sides by 3. This is where you need a calculator. I've got a whole bunch in the back. If you were to do 45 divided by 3, you would get 15. So x is equal to 15. Yep. So the other one, last thing, is I want to know, like, so I have these triangles, I want to be congruent. So I have then AB is equal to 4 and KL is 2T. So are those two things corresponding parts in those two triangles if they're going to be congruent? Is AB and KL, do they correspond?
Yes.
Yeah, right? You have AB, KL. So if they're going to be congruent, their measures have to be what? The same, so it has to be equal, right? Here, how do I get rid of the 2? Divide. So 2 is equal to T.